You're listening to the Curio-city Collective podcast.
I'm Arpita.
And I'm Deepika.
So here we are, the last month of season 1.
Here we are indeed, and I can't quite believe it's been almost 9 months of doing this.
It seems all the more surreal because we had this vision of being sorted and planned just last December, and we had our Excel sheets with too many columns and our campaigns all lined up. And we thought we had every parameter covered, and then bam, within 2 months of the podcast taking off, we have the pandemic come and hit us front and center. And some days it feels like I'm living in some sort of suspended time bubble. Because, it's crazy to think that the three of us, Srinidhi, you and I, were actually together here in Bangalore just before the first lockdown happened in March. And now we're in 3 different cities. But also that somehow in the times of social distancing, the length of the distance almost doesn't seem to matter. We're all just at home. And we could both be in Mumbai and I would still not be able to see you.
Yeah, there's definitely something really surreal about this time. Within our own bubbles, our individual homes, you can have days when it just feels like one long Sunday. There's crows at my window cawing for fruit. My partner and I go about cleaning the house and figuring out supplies, cooking, sitting, chatting, maybe watching a film. And it all feels like for a little bit that everything's fine and there's order in our world. But on the edges of your vision, looming constantly outside this bubble is this big sea of doubt. Because really everything's far from all right. And we're living in the middle of a pandemic and there's really terrible things that are happening.
True, making sense of what feels like a pause but isn't quite. It's hard. But just before we go any further, I think we should share with our listeners that this month is going to be our last month for season 1 of the Curio-city Collective podcast. And so we wanted to do things a little bit differently. Instead of opening a new conversation, we thought we'd look back at the ones we've had this season and try to sift what we've been learning and thinking, especially about the idea of well-being.
When we began this conversation on why we wanted to open our little NGO somewhere in 2019, we'd all been working a really long time in the development sector in India. And I think we'd begun to feel very deeply in our bones the impact of the multiple crises of our times. And at the time, it meant particularly the climate crisis-related disasters that we were seeing around the globe. And they were not just, environmental situations. These disasters had consequences which were socio-cultural, psychological, economical, just multifaceted. And alongside you had all these huge global scientific research bodies like the UN IPBES coming out with dire warnings of civilizational crisis. And that was based on the human impact on the natural world.
Life on Earth is in the worst state in hundreds of thousands of years, and human activity is to blame. That's the key finding of the UN body tasked with assessing the state of our planet's biodiversity. The million species currently face the threat of extinction, some within decades because of habitat destruction on land and sea. Animal and plant species are being lost at a rate tens or even hundreds of times faster than in the past.
These crises, as the reports were telling us, were strong indicators of us as a species making some seriously questionable choices. And this was something that required collective reflection and from there to evolve to corrective action.
Yeah, and that's how we decided that the space we wanted to create would be a learning ecosystem, beginning with our podcast, where we could bring together progressive, thoughtful people and ideas and discuss how each of us can consider, imbibe, and then practice the change required to alter the course.
And I think the second element which we should acknowledge is that it was also deeply personal. We chose to focus on Indian cities because they are the larger ecosystems within which we've all grown up. And we've seen them change massively through the last 2 decades of our lives and through various aspects of our work in the past. We'd been grappling with the idea of how these spaces were increasingly stretched and might possibly be becoming less friendlier to live in.
No, I think you're putting that rather gently. I mean, I remember the statistics we came across in the McKinsey report when we were researching this. And it said that by 2030, India is expected to have 590 million people living in cities, and that 68 cities would have a population of 1 million plus. And just to put that in perspective, I mean, the population of the US is currently about 330 million. So the implications of such rapid urbanization are unprecedented, and just multiple cities are already showing signs of being under severe stress.
You're right, of course. They are truly very huge numbers to begin to grapple with or make sense of. And this sense of urgency to consider the future and how we adapt to it that multiple reports have been indicating was also very much present in the conversations we had. For example, in the case of waste, when we spoke to Poonambir Kasturi of Daily Dump, she shared how large and overwhelming the issue of waste generation by one city could be if we viewed it at that level.
In 2006, we were looking at 2,800 kilos, 1,800 tons to 2,500 tons. Now the figures are 4.5 to 6, some people say. So that's the growth, right, in 13 years. And the density of the city has tripled almost. And the composition of waste has completely changed.
So yeah, she's explaining there how Bangalore in 2019 produced almost 6,000 metric tons of garbage per day, up from 2,500 to 3,000 tons in 2014-15, implying an almost doubling of waste production just within the span of a few years. And of course, Bangalore is far from alone in this. Cities have been struggling with their wastes, and just about each one of them has a haunting story of one or many waste yards where waste piles up without segregation, polluting groundwater, being an absolute health hazard. But the other conversation that really made me sort of sit up was the one with S. Vishwanath from Biome Trust. Because as I was prepping for that conversation, I realized something quite disturbing. That in 2019, all our metro cities had come really close to being completely out of drinking water, almost touching what is known as day zero when taps run completely dry. And this major issue of scarcity of water is also acknowledged by the government in a Niti Aayog report, which warned that 54% of India's groundwater wells are declining, and 21 major cities are expected to run out of groundwater as soon as 2020.
Wow, that's one more jolly fact to lighten up 2020. But I mean, you're right, of course, that from various perspectives, our cities might very soon be in very serious trouble. And issues like water and sanitation are at the heart of the idea of well-being. I mean, poorly managed waste and water both can imply very serious health repercussions. And of course, then there's the stress of living in constant uncertainty of not being able to access the most basic resources. And that really brings me back to the pandemic because, in some ways, like you're saying, these issues have been building up and were behind why we wanted to explore the concept of well-being in cities. But, in some ways, the pandemic and the lockdowns that ensued and the terrible humanitarian crisis of daily wage workers having, to leave the city in thousands, hungry and without wages, and walking hundreds of kilometers back home. And the fact that our public health systems were and continue to be so overwhelmed, it just told us how precarious life in the city already was for a huge number of people.
Working on that episode on the lockdown-related return migration was, really, really heartbreaking, I must admit. Just so many stories of endurance that should not be asked of anyone.
Though, as we were discussing some time back, in one way, this is very hard to acknowledge. The immense suffering that we're seeing now, and also hardships that people are facing through this period of social distancing. But I think in our case, the reason for wanting to say this out loud and to explore and map the many problems our cities are facing was not to chalk out some dark prophecy of doom.
Most certainly not. I hope, in fact, it's quite the opposite. I think I think how we've come to understand this is maybe how Rilke the poet once put it to his student. Why should you want to exclude from your life all unsettling, all pain, all depression of spirit, when you don't know what work it is these states are performing within you? Why do you want to persecute yourself with the question of where it all comes from and where it is leading? You well know you are in the period of transition and want nothing more than to be transformed.
I feel like copying that out and pinning it up on my softboard as we speak.
Yeah, I think it's, it's taken me a while to really process this advice. He later adds this little bit where he says, all one has to do is help it to be ill, to have its whole illness and let it break out, for that is how it mends itself. It sounds grim, but I think what he's simply trying to say is that our acceptance of the problem or the illness, of its existence and of its power over us, is the first step towards beginning to mend. And in some ways, how I see it is that the pandemic and the climate crisis, what they're doing is asking for our collective acknowledgement, our acceptance that something is not quite right. Until we begin to see this and accept it, we continue stalling and working against ourselves.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Strangely reminds me of the stages of grief. And I say grief because there is loss. There's so much loss, right? Especially with the pandemic, you can see it all the more clearly. There's loss of control, of steadiness, of predictability, of access to people we love and care for, access to planning our days and our lives. And, all this might seem abstract, but they're very real parameters that allow us to feel settled and directed. And so the loss of it really is quite an overwhelming one. And the process of grief, is now famously supposed to be in these 5 stages, right? Of denial, anger, bargaining, depression. And then once you plow through the mix of these experiences and emotions, in time, you're supposed to arrive at acceptance.
And from that place of acceptance, we can then begin to consider what needs to change to make things better.
Yeah, it's not lightly that the word transformative change is thrown around in the context of what we're experiencing. Unless we acknowledge and grieve for what was and is, how do we begin to know what's important? Because only by that hard-won knowledge are we granted the roadmap of truly transformative change.
As you say that, I'm reminded that the Greeks have this concept called metatonia, which is making a grand comeback, I think. I keep seeing it bandied about. And it implies a form of transformative change of heart, change that goes deep and reorganizes our insights. And that can only come through the hard task of dealing with our unpleasant realities.
Well, we'll come to really breaking down transformative change in our next and last episode of the season. So let's get back to well-being and what we've been learning through this season. Well, the one really important thing for me is certainly just how well-being is so complex, how it's an outcome of so many things that interact.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this was made evident right from our episode 1 and 2, where we explored mental health in cities, and Aparna Joshi of iCall, a psychosocial helpline, shared what they meant by the psychosocial approach.
So I think we have been trying to unpack this word called psychosocial for a very, very long time, because people either talk psycho or people talk social, and we are trying to combine both. So what do we mean by that? We are trying to say that people's internal realities, which are comprised of their own private thoughts, emotions, or their bodies, or their own experiences, are not so isolated from the larger social context in which they are living. Yeah? So those social contexts are very much a part of their narrative. Yeah? They are either determining the distress, they are contributing to the distress that people are facing.
Actually, this approach that emphasizes the relevance of social contexts and environments in shaping people's experience is also something that Jahanze Baldiwala from the Umeed Child Development Center also emphasized in our most recent episode. So it almost feels like coming full circle.
Aparna also put it across very nicely with an example, if I remember this right.
Poverty, unemployment are huge contexts, particularly in city. Yeah? So even struggles to find home and some safe spaces to talk, love, live, I think are missing. So we are trying to say that those larger social contexts are definitely contributing to your personal narratives and personal distress. So, while providing this service, we are mindful of both, and definitely conversations, therefore, I call holds, are not only addressing the personal distress but are also trying to make people mindful of these larger social contexts. And in our very, very modest way, we are trying to figure out how can people be made more resourceful so that they can negotiate better with these larger social structures also.
And really, nothing makes this clearer than what we've seen with the return migration of the poor, from cities to their native homes during the pandemic.
Yeah, I kept trying to capture the level of distress the lockdowns had precipitated, but it all felt inadequate somehow. Poverty and sudden unemployment were exactly the reasons that people who had been hovering on the edge of precarity found themselves completely thrown over. And the distress in this case was certainly not inspired by any biological reasons. Yet, as research has shown, the conditions such as those that the migrants experienced can be severely detrimental to their holistic health in both the short and the long term. As the lockdown extended into a period of 2 months, stories of Herculean journeys of more than hundreds and thousands of kilometers made on foot, cycles, or hitchhiking began making it to the news. One 20-year-old migrant boy cycled 1,700 kilometers in 7 days from Maharashtra in the west of India to reach his home state of Odisha in the east. On the road were not only laborers from the cities, but also those who were out of work from other regions where factories and farms had come to a standstill. Undertaken in moments of deep duress with little or no access to food, water, or shelter through the length of their journey in the height of Indian summer, with temperatures soaring to 40 plus degrees in many parts of the country, these stories of gargantuan physical undertakings were also stories of distress, abuse, starvation, exhaustion, and deep suffering. In their report, Jan Sahas noted how anguish, helplessness, and desperation largely defined the distress calls they received, about 12,000 in just the span of 10 days. So, yes, definitely. One thing that hits home is how multifaceted the idea of well being is, and that immediately makes it complex. There are just so many factors, internal and external, that mesh together to create a meaningful life.
Actually, it reminds me of the model we were talking about within the organization. You remember? It was Braun Friend Brenner's Ecological Systems Framework for Human Development.
Of course, it's one of my favorites, really. I remember coming across it in my early 20s, and I remember having this absolute aha moment when I saw it.
Yeah, I really love the way the diagram of the model helps represent some of that complexity we're speaking to. So, what it does is that it puts the individual at the center with their inherent multiple unique qualities. And then there are concentric circles that this person is at the center of. And each of these circles represents a systemic level. So, the first innermost circle is the microsystem. Then there's the meso, exo, and macro systems.
So it's like one of those Russian nesting doll sets, one system nested within the next. So the microsystem could represent, for example, your family and peer groups. And then the larger circles, like the exosystem, reference larger contexts like communities and institutions. And then the macro is about the attitudes and ideologies of the culture you're embedded in.
Yet, what is most powerful about the systems-based models and approaches is that even the psychosocial approach to mental health is that it not only tells us about the complex number of variables and layers that form the context of a human being, but it also tells us something very powerful about the interconnectivity of things.
You're right, that is powerful. There is not only the person context interrelatedness which is represented there, but also just how within an ecology multiple variables mesh and interact with each other. And in that sense, a set of concentric circles are possibly a simplification of the multi-relational nature of ecologies. But pictorially, it's useful in understanding the concept.
Yeah, so it's interesting also that Braunfeld-Brenner first came up with this idea specifically keeping a child at the center and explaining how the ecology of the child functions. I think that's great because, just last month we mapped something along the same lines in terms of the question of how children were experiencing and responding to the pandemic. And I mean, this is where we map the well being of a child by keeping them at the center and beginning to see her or him nested within their immediate family, extended family, peer groups, communities. And then we look at those embedded within larger institutions that support them, whether it's, school or healthcare. And then at another larger level, in terms of the policies which oversee these institutions and the cultural belief systems of the society that they're embedded within.
And when you approach it like this, then you can immediately see that a response to augment a child's well being is across all those systems. From policies which have guided and determined 10 standard boards, for example, or work-related policies which determine if parents can take time out to care for their child, even as they're trying to work from home, or coming closer if the child has a sibling or a peer who is around to spend time with them through this period of social isolation.
Yeah, I think it's a great methodology to adopt, as its applicability in understanding well-being and then responding is quite powerful. It's also a great tool for reflection, and if used from the perspective of keeping ourselves at the center as a citizen, and then seeing the multiple layers of systems within which we are nested, it gives us some sense of an idea of which elements of our environment need tweaking and what actions we can take to then change them. And that's really quite empowering. As we're speaking to the systems approach with regard to understanding how human beings interact with their social environments, what has been powerfully the theme to explore for this year is also how human beings interact with their natural environment.
You're right. And, it's not just because of the climate crisis. The two-part series we did on understanding the roots of this pandemic especially spoke to this. The COVID-19 coronavirus is what is termed a zoonotic disease, and these are diseases that are caused by the transmission of pathogens such as viruses from animals to people. And what is disturbing is that zoonotic diseases are on the rise in the last few decades, and the reason for this is human impact on ecosystems.
Zoonoses threaten economic development, animal and human well-being, and ecosystem integrity. Over the last few years, several emerging zoonotic diseases made world headlines as they caused or threatened to cause major pandemics. These include Ebola, bird flu, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome or MERS, Rift Valley fever, sudden acute respiratory syndrome or SARS, West Nile virus, and Zika virus disease. Researchers studying records that date from 1940 to 2004 detected an increase in the rate of emerging infectious disease over those years. Of the 335 documented events, 60.3% were zoonotic, and 71.8% of the zoonoses originated in wildlife.
Yes, that was shocking to consider, really, from the perspective of the current pandemic. I don't think most of us even now realize that this pandemic is caused by the huge impact of human intervention on natural systems.
During that time, I was reading this fabulously interesting book called Spillover by David Quammen. It was published somewhere in 2012, and it follows the trail of multiple zoonotic diseases to demystify them and understand their origins. And in the book, he clearly says this. He says, "Make no mistake, they are connected. These disease outbreaks coming one after another. And they are not simply happening to us. They represent the unintended results of things we are doing. They reflect the convergence of two forms of crisis on our planet. The first crisis is ecological, the second is medical."
And did you also tell me that he says that the most serious outbreak on the planet Earth is that of the species of Homo sapiens?
Yeah, Unfortunately, that's true. And as an old Nat Geo associate, it's amazing the places he travels to, the stories he traces, from the deepest and remotest of African jungles to highly classified infectious disease labs in America and Russia. And that is his conclusion. And it's not only his conclusion, it's the conclusion of scientists around the world. We even quoted Sonia Shah, journalist and author of the book Pandemic Tracking Contagion from Cholera to Ebola and Beyond. And she says pretty much the same thing.
We've lost the bigger picture, the connections between social and political health and environmental health. So, what we're seeing right now is an intense amount of reductionism. Moving forward, what we have to see is that pandemics, climate disasters, all of these are related to our huge footprint on the planet. We've been using up a lot of natural resources, and now the bill is coming due. We're going to lurch from disaster to disaster to disaster until we start to really change the fundamental relationship between us and nature.
And that's something that we're hearing from all the biggies now. All the large scientific institutions are putting their weight behind the urgent need for rethinking how we as a species engage with our environment. You know, bodies associated with the UN have always been careful about how they represent difficult issues, trying their best to not sound too cataclysmic, more open to conversation, and keeping it neutral toned. But in the last few years, we're seeing a huge difference in that language. We're hearing them outrightly say that we need to challenge business as usual and begin to work on transformative change. This urgency is significant because it tells us something about the crossing over of tipping points.
Yeah, so in some ways, this is the final really big circle within which we're all nested. You know, it's reminding me strangely of this Carl Sagan quote, which says, "Cosmos is a Greek word for the order of the universe. It is, in a way, the opposite of chaos. It implies the deep interconnectedness of all things. It conveys awe for the intricate and subtle way in which the universe is put together."
That is a beautiful quote. And yes, this deep interconnectedness of all things is what seems to be the strong underlying message of the multiple crises of our times. And really, it seems a fair extension to the idea of an ecological systems approach to human well being to also acknowledge and include the most basic context we all exist within, our natural environments.
Yeah, and a lot of research has been coming out in support of this reiteration of our ties with the natural world. I mean, even if we enter it from the mental and physical health perspective, and we've shared in our campaigns and our multiple episodes the startling amount of research that's piling up in favor of how improving our relationship with nature also leads to improvements in our overall well-being.
So, where does all this bring us, you think?
But I think it's useful to summarize, and so tell me if this covers it. For one thing, we need to rethink the industrial world idea that saw humans pitted against nature, and overwhelming amounts of research are showcasing that human well-being is not separate and at odds with planetary well-being. So that is one of the big questions of our times. How do we reconstruct our relationship with the natural world? And two, I think there is the core nature of well-being itself that we need to acknowledge. That our individual well-being is tied to that of our communities and of our larger social and environmental contexts. That apart from being multi-layered and multi-dimensional, well-being is also cross-disciplinary. And by that I mean simply that we cannot speak of the issue of human health and not connect it to, for example, the health of our ecosystems. And we've seen air pollution, poor sanitation, and waste management. All of these are intrinsically linked to our health, which is why one of the new novel approaches has been the One Health movement, which recognizes the growing connection between the health of animals, people, and the environment. And of course, at the heart of all this is the core idea of interconnectedness. So do you think that covers it all?
Yes, that sounds about right. And, strangely, it reminds me of a conversation with Chitra Vishwanath, the architect, who basically disliked the idea of all designations and titles, but ultimately, when compelled, chose to call herself an architect of an ecosystem.
Yeah, I can see why you're reminded of it because, really, I think even in the conversation, she was implying that all of us are in some ways tasked with this, that in all our actions, grand or small, we're all architects within ecosystems based on the choices we are making about who we want to be or what values we represent.
And also, I think what came out powerfully in the conversation with Chitra was the idea of monetary valuation or economic value being a very limited, if not harmful, way of understanding the world around us. There's a very nice Robert Kennedy quote that we've even put on our website, I think, that says this very eloquently. And here he's speaking in the specific context of the limitations of the GNP. He says, the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything in short except that which makes life worthwhile.
Oh, I love that quote. And I think, even though this is far from a popular idea, for the last decade or two, we have actually been seeing countries challenge the idea of the GDP representing, how well a country is doing and how citizens are doing holistically. And so it's interesting also to consider it, but the person who first came up with the idea of GDP, Simon Kuznets, also stated quite clearly that distinctions must be kept in mind between quantity and quality of growth, between its costs and return, and between the short and long term. That the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income.
Yeah, we seem to have lost that somewhere, but I think the time is here for us to reclaim the idea of well-being being larger than GDP. So many countries are already showing us the way here. Our tiny neighbor Bhutan was a pioneer in this conversation with their happiness index and framework. And in more recent times, we're seeing countries like New Zealand, Scotland, and Iceland take the lead.
When we began this conversation, I was a little afraid that we were getting a bit, gloom and doom. But look at us. We've come to a good place, haven't we? And I think it really helps to know that we're not stagnantly standing in old ideas and, that change, even if it's small, it's taking place.
Totally agree. In these times when we are in our little individual bubbles, like we said, our homes, one can't help but wonder, does it matter if I do this little thing of not consuming too much or of composting my waste? Am I making a difference? Am I not too small? I think in those times of doubt, it's always been useful for me to look at the full ecological system of well-being and to find solace in it. Because within this large spread of layered systems, there might not be people immediately in my microenvironment who think or act like me. But there are people and institutions and other such spaces which are functioning across various parts of the web, which do share the values I embody.
True, that idea of interconnectedness is also powerful because in its knowledge rests the idea that we don't have to do things alone, and that by nurturing connection, we build resilience and possibility. And maybe it's apt that we close this episode with the words of one of our favorite writers, Wendell Berry. And he says, "Only by restoring the broken connections can we be healed. Connection is health. And what our society does its best to disguise from us is how ordinary, how commonly attainable health is. We lose our health and create profitable diseases and dependencies by failing to see the direct connections between living and eating and working and loving." Dear listener, thank you for being on this journey with us. We're a tiny NGO, and your attention and love has been deeply meaningful to each of us. We hope you'll continue to share this journey of exploring well-being and transformative change in action in Indian cities with us by joining our newsletter and being part of our social media spaces. In our last episode for the season, We look at the wisdom we've gleaned from the concept of transformative change in action from season 1 of the TCC podcast. We would absolutely love to hear from you on what you've thought, felt, and explored as you've heard our episodes. You can write to us at team@thecuriositycollective.org. You could also explore the other episodes of the season at www.thecuriositycollective.org. This episode was made with the support of Srinidhi Raghavan and is produced by the Bangalore Recording Company.